So the so-called black boxes on the doomed JeJu Air 737 worked as they were supposed to. They didn't fail at all. Instead, the problem was that the plane failed, not the bright orange boxes. And I'm going to tell you why using the perfect analogy. You know that age-old adage, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there to hear it, well, does it make a sound? Well, does it? I'll explain. Next on Maximus.
You are watching Maximus Aviation.
Greetings everybody, Maximus here. So in my last full video on the subject, I said I thought we were done extensively covering this JeJu Air disaster. And then in closing, I said now all we have to do is wait for the black boxes to be analyzed and then all would be revealed. However, I never considered that both the cockpit and voice recorder would be blank. So now to be fair, I may be wrong, but I understand that they do have the recording up until 4 minutes before the crash, but most likely that's not going to be very helpful. It's just going to be pilot chatter, and they don't have what they need to get the cause of why they did what they did and why they did it, how they did it. You know, kind of like watching the movie The Usual Suspects and leaving at the end before you find out that Kaiser Sose was Kevin Spacey. Oh, sorry, spoiler alert. So today we're going to start out in South Korea and end up in the Hudson River. So let's start with the facts as we know so far. Well, one thing we know for sure is that we know a lot less than we actually do know. So let's start with what we actually do know. Fact, at 8:54 a.m. local time, JeJu Air Flight 2216 was authorized to land at Muon International Airport in South Korea. As the plane was preparing to land, it was warned at 8:57 a.m. about the potential for a bird strike. Shortly thereafter, the pilots broadcast a Mayday alert, in fact, due to multiple bird strikes that we've all seen by now from the video taken from the ground. It was then that the crew advised they were going around. This was followed by authorization to land in the opposite direction, and the flight crew immediately pulled a 180 and swung around for the opposite direction emergency landing. Then at 8:59, all communications and data were cut between the aircraft and the ground. Fact. We know at least one engine ingested birds and suffered a compressor stall from that video taken on the ground. Fact, or let's call this fact-ish, because from the ground we were granted a faraway view. So it looked like neither engine was destroyed or had an explosive release of material into the aircraft fuselage that would have damaged it, but we don't know for sure, but it looks like everything was fine as far as that goes. Fact, the crew was facing some unknown emergency so serious they whipped a Yui and came back to the airport hot and fast. Fact, we know the crew didn't deploy the landing gear or the flaps for the emergency belly landing, nor did they deploy the RAT or ram air turbine, because the 737 doesn't have one because the batteries are supposed to handle all those duties. Note to Boeing, you screwed the pooch on that one. However, what we don't know is why they didn't deploy the gear or the flaps, or a lot of other things. Another fact is we know from visually observing the belly landing that the right engine was working, at least to the point that we could hear it and see the thrust exhaust door open. But we also know that the left engine was not operating due to the fact that there was no exhaust visible, plus the lack of damage the engine experienced during the crash. And last but not least, the most important fact, we do know this. If there wasn't a giant steel reinforced concrete bomb shelter wall too close to the end of the runway, we wouldn't be talking about this story at all, and 179 families would be together today. You know what it's like if you jump off a cliff? It's not the jump that kills you. It's the splat of hitting the ground part that kills you. So that's what we do know. However, what we don't know, well, you could fill a library with that information. Such as why did the pilots have to turn around on a dime and had no time to configure the aircraft for an emergency landing? Why didn't they drop the landing gear manually? And now we just found out the cockpit data recorders didn't record any information 4 minutes before the crash. And how is that even possible? And finally, and most importantly, especially to today's video, why didn't they start the APU, the auxiliary power unit, which is a smaller turbojet engine in the tail, used for all sorts of backup systems for the aircraft? Had they started the APU, they would have had all the systems they needed for an emergency landing, including the landing gear, flaps, and any other informational gauges they would need. I'm sure you all recall the Miracle on the Hudson. No, not the movie. The movie was fiction. Well, it was real, but it was really fictional. But during the actual event, we found out a couple of things about that Hudson water landing where they lost both engines after hitting a flock of giant geese. One, Sullengerger is the pilot, but Michael Jordan was the basketball. And that kind of skill only comes from a lifetime of experience and self-confidence. Did the JeJu crew have that kind of ability? Well, it's too early to tell, and without a CVR, we'll never know. But it sure seems like they were flying the hell out of that plane. So at this point, I have no reason to believe the crew intentionally did anything wrong. Still, they could have. But now, most likely, we'll never know. But anyway, back to Sully. Aviation experts the world over have come to the conclusion that there is one thing that Sully did during the event that was highly scrutinized at the time in the early stages, and wasn't on the checklist, at least not in that order. And the first thing that Sully did without thinking was he turned on the APU, before any emergency checklists or trying to relight the engines. And that instinctive move was the difference between life and death, and also why there was power to the black boxes as well. Why does that matter? Well, prior to 2016 and even until today, in some cases, backup battery power to the black boxes wasn't mandatory. And especially for some reason, Boeing being Boeing failed to include the data and voice recorders on their battery backup system. So back in 2009, battery backup wasn't mandatory and most airlines didn't employ it. And it wasn't until 2012 that in the US at least that the FAA implemented the battery backup as mandatory. Okay, so Maximus, everybody isn't as chill or as skilled as Sully Sullengerger. We get it, so what's your point? Well, we know the black boxes stopped recording or didn't record data for 4 minutes before the JeJu crash. But we also know about 4 minutes before the crash, the ADS-B communications with JeJu Air was lost. So what does that imply? Well, a major electrical failure, as in a monumental foobar failure. So obviously something dramatic happened 4 minutes before the crash landing. Something electrical, either caused by the bird strike, or it would have been something unheard of that the pilots did to turn off the black boxes. But what if after the pilots declared their mayday, suddenly, and without warning, they looked at their cockpit instruments and they just all went black? Gone. Lights out in the entire plane. Well, now what the hell do you do? Well, you go old school stick and rudder and get that plane back on the ground any way you can. But how do you do it without instruments? Well, on most modern aircraft, especially on the old dog, the 737, in a total electric failure on a Boeing 737, pilots would still have access to the following instruments: airspeed indicator, altimeter, vertical speed indicator, turn coordinator, and magnetic compass. Like I said, old school. The basic mechanical gauges are still present as backup instruments, even on modern glass cockpits, allowing them to maintain basic control of the aircraft. So it wouldn't be easy. But as far as I can tell, with the information we have, these pilots did a hell of a job getting that plane back on the ground. So finally, for those of you still watching, that brings us back to the black boxes. Why did they stop working? Well, the answer is they didn't stop working at all. However, the plane's electrical system stopped working, and without that, there was no way for the plane to communicate with the black boxes. Put it this way, if you're expecting a phone call from somebody at a specific time, and they forgot to call you, say their phone dies and you don't know it, you're going to just be waiting by your phone for that call. And if that call never comes and you never hear from that person again, you'll never know why they didn't call you. However, your phone was ready and able to take the call. They just never called. Well, that was the situation with the black boxes. The black boxes were in fact waiting for the phone call, but the plane never called. Like I said, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody is there to hear it, does it make a sound? Of course it makes a sound. The only problem is nobody was there to hear it. So after all my yapping and theories, what new have we learned? Well, pretty much nothing. And that's the problem. Sadly, now we're going to add this crash to a long list of aviation mysteries, beginning with Amelia Earhart all the way up to Malaysian Air. But in closing, I will say this. No matter what caused all the aircraft malfunctions or if the pilots totally screwed something up in the air, the plane did not kill these people. That stinking concrete bunker wall of death did. And as I said it before, I'm going to say it again. That's a hill, no pun intended, but that truth is a hill that I am willing to die on. And with that, it's your turn. Tell me what you think. At this point, since all the experts are clueless, I might as well be too. But what do you think? Let me know down below. And don't forget to do all that YouTube-y stuff on your way out. And as always, until next time, yeah, this is Maximus.